So I'd like to introduce our next panel, but before I do that, there's an announcement about the room change for the panels this afternoon, and I'm going to announce this again. But anything that is marked as happening in room 310 is actually happening in room 305. So you can take that down as a note. So our next panel is going to be on lessons learned in some of these serious games. The members of the panel are, first of all, Steve York, who's a multimedia and film producer, who's produced a string of very successful and highly acclaimed documentaries, including A Force More Powerful, which was later converted or transformed into a serious game that informs the thinking of for people who are doing nonviolent protest. Asi Burak, who is the co-president of Games for Change and co-founded Impact Games, which created games including Peacemaker and Play the News. And Heather Chaplin, who is an assistant professor of journalism at the New School and the author of Smart Bomb, The Quest for Art, Entertainment, and Big Bucks in the Video Game Revolution. So with that, if our panelists can come up and have a seat. Yep. I guess those are for the next. All right. All right, Steve.
Thank you. We have slides, and can I see what's up? Oh, there we go. All right, I'll try to keep track. PeoplePower is a game which teaches the skills of civil resistance, kind of an academic term. In practice, in particular, the strategy of nonviolent action. Steve York, I'm the producer of this game, and I represent also the game's sponsor, the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict, and my own company, York Zimmerman, Inc. We should change the slide. I'm sorry, I don't know who's doing this. I don't have control over it. 6 years ago, we released an earlier game, A Force More Powerful, whose purpose was quite similar to the PeoplePower game. Great, thank you. Feedback from users of that game, many thousands, in fact, were what led us to produce the current game, PeoplePower. By comparison, PeoplePower is a lot easier to learn. When we brought out A Force More Powerful, one review was headlined, A Force More Complicated. It was a complicated game, and we've, I think, managed to make it a far less steep learning curve. It's easier to learn. It offers much more flexible scenario design. It has simpler language localization chores. It runs on PCs, Macs, and Linux, unlike the earlier game, which ran only on PCs. It's also downloadable, whereas A Force More Powerful is distributed solely on physical disks. The download for PeoplePower is well under 50 megabytes, whereas the earlier game distributed on disk was the whole disk, 800 megabytes, I think. PeoplePower is a turn-based, single-player strategy game. It ships with 4 scenarios, one of which involves an anti-corruption struggle, a second is a struggle for minority rights, a third is an occupation of a country, and the fourth is a fight against a dictatorship. So the scenarios are in effect defined by who the adversary is. The person playing the game is in charge of the movement. And the movement is a generic term for the nonviolent group that's trying to bring change. Generically, we call it the movement in every scenario, whereas the adversary in every scenario is called the regime. This home screen represents the headquarters of a nonviolent movement, and the player takes charge of that movement in a struggle against the adversaries. In addition, the game comes with a scenario builder tool, which allows the player to, at the maximum, create his or her own scenario from scratch. They can also modify the scenarios that come with the game, make them more difficult, or change the characteristics or the attributes of certain elements within the game. The idea of creating scenarios from scratch allows the possibility of building a scenario, for example, based on the situation in Zimbabwe, where you've got a pro-democracy movement fighting against Robert Mugabe. And you could put in the names of all the characters, all the political entities, all the civil society groups in Zimbabwe and play out the game based on those factors. You could also put in, create a scenario based on something that happened in the past. I mean, choose an element or a portion of the American Civil Rights Movement and play the game based on that with those characters in those places and so forth. The scenario builder, I don't know, it's going to be very hard to read this stuff. I'll just skip. Come back to the movement headquarters. Just to say a few words, gameplay is intended to teach values and processes. It's not intended to be a recipe book. I mean, you cannot, if you're an opposition movement or a resistance movement in a country like Zimbabwe that I just mentioned, or in Burma, for example, there are plenty of countries in the world where there are opposition political movements or resistance movements of various kinds who might learn something and find some benefits in playing this game. But it's not going to tell them how to go out and make a revolution. What it's going to do is teach them how to think about strategy by planning the way tactics, what tactics to use, when in the game, in what sequence, and so forth. I'm just going to skip through a few slides as I continue talking, rather than refer specifically to them. There is no single route to victory, and there are almost no fatal errors. It's possible to recover from bad decision and still win. It might take longer. It's also open-ended in the sense that you can choose your own victory condition. You may decide it's enough to compel the regime to permit free and fair elections. At the extreme, you might want to achieve the total defeat or collapse of the regime. The game requires the player to analyze the situation, analyze the characters, their attributes, and their positions on issues. And in simple terms, the goal is to attract as many characters as possible to join the movement or the movement coalition, or to persuade groups such as political parties, labor unions, student associations, media organizations to endorse or actively join in the work of the movement. Now, one key to this form of struggle is sequencing. You learn quickly that organizing mass protest or public actions in the streets is probably not the right thing to do at the beginning of your struggle. You should instead concentrate on building organization, on recruiting, training, fundraising, these kinds of things, to build up strength before you make yourself too visible in the streets, because regimes have a way of pretty much neutralizing any movement that simply puts 1 million people in the street before they're organized enough to actually achieve anything. I just probably should conclude by saying that I've just come back from a couple of weeks in Egypt. I was in Egypt 2 weeks, ending day before yesterday, and then 2 weeks in March, working on a new film about the revolution that occurred there early this year. What was interesting to me was, in the process of interviewing many of the people who were involved in ousting Hosni Mubarak, I discovered among the youth leaders that many of them had discovered our game, which has been available for download in open beta since last June, almost a year. We didn't push it. We depended on kind of word-of-mouth viral campaign, and many of them had found it one particular guy with the April 6th movement that's been very much in the news because of their use of technology, in particular Facebook, had played the game quite a bit, and he said he found it very difficult, which didn't surprise me. We meant it to be difficult, and we meant it to be a kind of game that even if you don't win, in quotes, in the classical sense of winning, you still learn something. Even if you don't win, or you don't win decisively, you still learn something. But he said, we lost the game, but fortunately we won the revolution. And I thought that was a perfectly nice situation to discover. I think, whether he knows it or not, he probably did get something out of the game, but I'm not making any claims. The point is, the major complaint was that the game's not available in Arabic. It will be, by the way, probably within a month, because we've already started work on language localizations in Russian, Arabic, and Spanish. There will be more languages to come. But I think the situation in Egypt is a terrific example of, and I've just got a few pictures from things that happened. The April 6th movement, this picture is in their headquarters, is a perfectly good example of young people up to 30, 35 years of age who are very aware of the outside world and had managed to find on the internet and through other sources all kinds of reading material, manuals, guidebooks on how you go about running this kind of a revolution or this kind of a movement, and had been doing so for some years and had done a lot of things right. I think there's no question, if you compare what they were doing in Egypt, and culminating in the famous 18 days starting the 25th of January in Tahrir Square in Cairo, what they were doing would have, first of all, it matches entirely the kinds of skills, the kinds of ideas, the kind of strategic thinking, the kinds of political analysis that this game is intended to teach, and I think does teach. And so I'm very encouraged that that they actually found our material, and I'm just going to skip through these slides, and that's the end of my slides. I think the most important thing for me to have done in my very brief time here is to describe the game in very simple terms, and hope to answer some of your questions.
Asi, we'll go to you, and then Heather, and then we'll do some questions.
I'll use the podium so you can look at the slides. So I'm here under two hats, and some of that you'll see in the next panel. I started a company, a for-profit company called Impact Games, out of Carnegie Mellon, and we took serious games or games for change for the into the commercial space. And that's what I'm going to talk in this short segment. But I'm also now heading Games for Change, which is a non-profit. And it's a very different perspective. And a lot of the things that we'll discuss in lessons learned are things that I'm trying in Games for Change as a non-profit and kind of as a community platform to solve for other developers, other funders, other commissioners of games. In terms of impact games, the first product we launched that got some attention and is very related to the issues that the state is dealing with is Peacemaker. Peacemaker was a strategy game launched in 2007. We developed most of it in Carnegie Mellon, as I mentioned, with Israelis, Palestinians, and American experts. And the idea of Peacemaker is that you actually can make peace at the end of the game. That was the winning solution between... You could make peace between Israel and Palestine. And even more than that, you could play both perspectives. So you could actually switch during the game or after you played one perspective and play the Israeli leader versus the Palestinian leader. And they're very different games. It's asymmetric. One is very powerful and one is actually under occupation. And to even show that to an Israeli perspective or American perspective was very important. What I want to show you is a very short video, and we'll talk after that.
Peacemaker is a game in which you take the role of one of the leaders. You can take either the role of the Israeli Prime Minister or the Palestinian President. You can play both perspectives. And the idea is that as the leader, you have to react to real-time events happening in the world. You can negotiate with other leaders, but you also have security or military actions that you can take. And by doing so, you have to reach a peaceful solution while in office.
In an Israeli high school, a new computer game called Peacemaker was launched today. Children playing the role of Israeli and Palestinian leaders trying to make peace in a virtual world of suicide bombings and Israeli military strikes.
We don't expect to address all issues of the conflict. We don't expect to give all the answers. We're bringing up issues for discussion.
I think the best aspect of playing this game is that, especially if you're a Palestinian student in the territories or an Israeli student within Israel, you get a chance to really feel what both sides are thinking and get a better sense of what they can do together to work towards peace.
If you look at the video game industry today, there are so many games out there about violence, about war, about destructions. We say a simple thing: there is certainly a place for one little game about peace.
And the reason I show this video is, and that's kind of a commentary on the whole day or the 2 days that you're going to explore. We talk a lot about the theory, and we dissect a lot how to make serious games, and I think it's very important. But there's something to be said about the passion. And, you know, the fact that, you know, a group of students come with an idea and go all the way, and also about the audience. The reason I wanted you to feel a bit the media coverage and the people that play and what they say about the game. Again, those are very important things. We're talking about an experience, and we're not only developing a back-end tool or a programming tool. We're actually making a game that we want people to get through the head, but also through the heart. And get something that is beyond just understanding and instructions, get something that actually change something in their perspective. After that, and I'll go over that very quickly, we made a product called Played and Used, and that was a direct consequence of Peacemaker. The idea was, okay, Peacemaker was perceived very well, but it was limited. It was only around the conflict in the Middle East, and it wasn't updated. Played and Used was a social gaming platform, one of the early ones, and the whole idea was, how do we update news as they come? And now we let people, almost in a day, respond to world events and predict the results and come back, just like in Fantasy League, to see how they equal to other players. The last thing I think is the most important one is my takeaways. I'll do it kind of give you the 4 or 5 things that I think were most important to us as a lesson, and we can then talk about it with the other members of the panel. One thing that we didn't have is a publisher, and I think that this is one of the main gaps in our space. The idea that in every other industry, even in books and films, and definitely in the commercial game space, you can go to someone that will take care of your marketing and distribution. In our case, there was no one like that, and you need to do it yourself. And it's very demanding, because beyond creative, beyond the design, you need to take care of all those things. The other one is that creativity is not only about the design and gameplay. So one thing we did was a very creative distribution deal with an NGO in Israel. And that NGO bought 100,000 copies of the game. And that was probably the biggest moment that we had. And it's very untraditional. And they took the 100,000 games, 80,000 they gave free in a newspaper for subscribers, and 20,000 they use in workshops until this day. And it has a life of its own. They keep on going, they're funding themselves. And again, that's creative distribution, and something we didn't plan for at the beginning. The idea of context. It's very important to think who you design for. We did it in the design phase of Peacemaker, but we kind of neglected it later on. And we worked with teachers, but when we went into the market, we didn't prepare the materials, we didn't prepare the marketing and distribution for that audience. And this is very important. Do you design it to someone to find it by their own? Do you design it for a platform that people will virally spread it? Or do you design it for a moderated environment and expect teachers to work with it, or other community centers? And the last one is impact and evaluation. As a for-profit company, we didn't do any of that. I mean, we definitely aimed at impact, but we didn't evaluate it. The more I'm in this space, and especially in the Games for Change context, I think that evaluation is key. It's costly, but it's super important because it ties your impact objectives and conclude in a way that you can go on and scale it and convince other people that you have real results. So these are kind of my lessons learned, and thank you very much for coming and listening. Thanks.
All right. Heather.
I don't have any slides, so I don't need it. My name is Heather Chaplin. Unlike Steve and Asi, I'm not a game maker. I'm a journalist, and I've been covering games since about 2001. So my perspective is very much that of an observer. And the thing that has kept me in the game space all these years is I've really lost pretty much all interest in the commercial mainstream game space, but the work that's going on in indie games and serious games seems really meaningful and really important to me, so I've sort of stuck around covering that. And I actually thought, since we only have a few minutes each to talk, and Steve and Asi both, have the experience and knowledge of actually putting out a game, I thought that I would share some of the things, some of the lessons over the last few years from a more sort of theoretical perspective, in the sense of, what is a game, and sort of what some of the thinking is about that from some of the really great game theorists out there who, I hear talk at Games for Change and places like that. So I hope that's useful. It's sort of ironic. I usually feel like as a journalist, I'm the guy saying, stop being so theoretical. What do you actually mean? So bear with me. But I think one of the key things that's been learned over the last handful of years is we've started to get a really deep understanding of what a game is and how it's different than other forms of media. And I think this is important. I mean, certainly in the journalism space, one of the things that we're thinking about now with every story is what's the best way to tell my story. It might be a written 1,200-word piece, or it might be a digital application, or it might be infographics, or it might be data visualization. So I think it's the same thing. Games are not the answer to everything, but there are some things that games are really great for. And probably the sort of key nugget that I feel like has emerged is this idea that games are a complex, dynamic system. And when I say that, I don't mean complex as the opposite of simple, but rather complex meaning the level of interconnectedness. So, for example, when a person is actually playing a video game, they're engaging with the processes of the system itself. So what's an example of a complex dynamic system in the real world? A really easy, great example is global warming, right? We run our cars here, and I live in New York, or here in DC. The exhaust affects, the polar bear's habitat, or the coal plants in China affect the air in Europe. So you start to see that when you have a complex dynamic system, every component, every variable affects every other variable. And so it's important to not just look at a certain aspect, but to look at the relationship between the different aspects and the way that the different variables affect one another. And games are little models of complex dynamic systems. So when you give somebody a game to play, they're actually playing with how that system works. So one of the big lessons we've learned in the last few years is this idea that games are really great for fostering systems thinking. And the reason I would say this is so important is sort of twofold. One, as we live in an increasingly globalized world where the level of interconnection between people, between economies, between states gets more and more heightened, it becomes more and more important that people start to be able to think systemically, not just linearly. So games can be really powerful for fostering that. And the other thing is that we increasingly live in a world of artificial intelligence systems, right? Everything from the way we bank to the way we make friends online to, almost every aspect of our life is increasingly dominated by artificial intelligence systems, and that are we going to have the literacy to be able to really understand these systems that are playing such an important role in our life? Which leads me to the next point I want to make, which is one of the other great points that's come out. There's been a lot of work done recently about play, because when you're engaging with a game, you are playing. And play is how primates learn, right? All animals, from dogs to humans to whales to gorillas, we all play. That's how we learn. And there's a lot of interesting work being done about rethinking of play not as sort of an infantile pursuit, but as something that's very important for people to do, even as grown-ups, as a way to learn. There's also a lot of thinking about that the best way to understand a system and to deal with the system is to play with it, because play is the human interaction with a set of rules. So there's also some thinking out there that there's something, I don't know if subversive is too strong a word, but I kind of like it, something sort of subversive about play, because play is when people push back against rules. And so I think there's something really interesting there to be thinking about, that when you give somebody a game, they're going to be engaging in play, which is being in an experimental mindset, being in an open mindset, being able to learn, and being thinking in the sense of what can I do? What can I do with these rules? What happens if I push back? Which I also think in contemporary life is probably an important thing for people to be able to do. And then just the last point that I wanted to make was there was a talk at Games for Change a couple years ago by a guy named Frank Lantz, who's a really important game thinker. He runs the NYU Game Center. And he made this point that's just stuck with me. I don't necessarily have anything incredibly concrete to say about it, but I want to throw it out there, which was, there's a lot of talk about games as another media, another way of transmitting information. And he put out there that this is the wrong way to think about games, and that games actually create a space, whether it's physical or virtual, which allows for emergent behavior, right? So that, like for the example that the woman gave of what happened with people turning their shields pink, nobody can ever anticipate what's going to happen in a game, right? Because you have people playing against the rule set. So all kinds of emergent behavior happens. And I think that there's something that's an idea that's really worth thinking about, that has a lot of potential, because when you have emergence, you start to have the potential for creative problem solving. So I wonder about the potential of games in terms of new solutions kind of coming out that nobody, including the game designer, could have expected. So I think I'll leave it there, and then if that wasn't clear or too theoretical, I'm happy to talk more on it.
Before we open it up to the audience for questions, one question, I guess, for Steve and Asi, what is the hardest lesson that you think you had to learn in your creation and distribution of these games? And obviously you covered a few points, but what do you think is the most common pitfall or stumbling block that someone who wants to go into this, serious games for change type project, the obvious thing that they would think of to do, which turns out to be completely wrong?
I had no idea that I would be answering this question, but I will respond gut level, just quick, from the gut. It is the notion that you have to, the idea of making a game for people who've never made a game before, which we hadn't. I'm a filmmaker. We discovered that there's a tremendous kind of vacuum out there for people who want to learn how to wage these kinds of struggles. There's almost nothing there other than some fairly dense, 100, 300, 500-page long books. And the idea is that since we knew nothing about making a game, we should just hire a game production company, a game developer, which we did. It's kind of everything under one roof. Designers, programmers, artists, music people, QA department, all of that. They did the best they could. But the second time around, first of all, we had a lot of experience showing that first game. One day, I was not present at this particular encounter, but one of my colleagues, Ivan Marovic, who was part of the youth movement that defeated Slobodan Milosevic in Serbia and is a brilliant sort of political strategist and a game fanatic, he was showing the game, I think, at PopTech a few years ago, and he happened to run into Will Wright, who's a very famous guy associated with The Sims and creator of The Sims. And Will looked at it and said, well, yeah, it's kind of interesting, but let me just give you an idea. And so Will said to Ivan, here's a slogan. You need a game which has very simple rules. And now I'm coming back to what Heather just said. You have a system that has certain rules, and you play within those rules. You need a game which involves very simple rules which lead to complex situations. That became, along with one other, and I'll tell you that in a second, a touchstone, a slogan for production of our second game. And the second was that we're developing a game for people who don't play games. And there's a huge audience of gamers who buy these first-person shooters and games like Grand Theft Auto, about whom there are certain assumptions, what they're looking for, what kinds of conventions need to be built into the game, and so forth. That's not our target. We realized from the beginning, and I think it's been borne out, that our game is aimed at people who've never played a computer game, a video game in their lives, and probably will never play another one. They're interested in this because of the circumstances of their lives, and probably not interested in gaming as such. So a game for people who don't play games. And with that in mind, we ended up producing the second game on an a la carte basis, where we hired a freelance game designer as an individual, not part of a company. And then all the other pieces, an AI, an artificial intelligence consultant, who was completely unconnected with anybody, just dealt with artificial intelligence. Eventually, a software development company that had never done a game before, but they happened to have great skills in producing what's called productivity software, which is aimed at people who are not highly computer literate but need to get into something easily and quickly. So we essentially became, the analogy is if you're going to build a house, you normally hire a contractor who hires an electrical contractor and a structural engineer and all these. We became the general contractor and hired all the pieces individually. A lot more work for us, but I think it was a very important lesson that paid off.
Yes, so we are, as you can imagine, approached by many individuals and organizations that want to go into the space. So yesterday I got an email from the Scottish government. 2 days ago it was a filmmaker that wants to extend his property into gaming. 3 days ago it was a non-profit. It's very diverse. I would say, though, that the most common mistake or the thing that I think leads to failure is that instead of going through a process that you would go with any product, if you wanted to make a documentary, people jump into the creative. So most of those conversations are like, well, I have this idea, it's really cool, I want to make this game, it's going to look like this and that. And then the question to me is, okay, so what do you think is the time and the budget? And I need to put it in the proposal. And what we usually do is do the pause. And we usually say, let's go back a few steps. And the most important things that we usually highlight before we even get to creative and solutions is to say, who's your audience? But let's define it very clearly. And let's not define only an age group. Let's also think about the psychology of that audience and their gaming ability and which region they are in. And let's try to define it. It can be very narrow, it can be very broad, like Ben said, but let's understand that audience. The second one is the context that I mentioned. Where your game is going to be played. Is it going to be played at home? Is it going to be played in the classroom, in a community center? Audience and context together will give you a very good idea of who you're aiming it for. And the last one, which is to me the most important one, is your learning and impact objectives. Sometimes they go together, sometimes they're separate. But what are the 2-3 takeaways you want people to get from your game? When they finish playing it, whether it's one session, whether it's 3 months. What do you want them to say? What do you want them to do? It could be really that you're aiming for direct action, that you actually want them to donate money or to go somewhere, but it could be that you're only interested in skills and knowledge. Again, should be very defined. And I think that once people, or those people that want to go into the space and make games for the first time, answer those questions, then it's much easier to say, okay, this is a creative solution, this is a platform we want to choose, this is the budget, this is how we're going to market it. But before you have those questions, it's very, very hard to jump into, this is my creative, cool idea.
And just to synthesize between you, and this echoes as well what Arjun said in his presentation, is that there's a fair amount of thought and research that goes on before the sort of creative vision is put together. In advertising would be called account planning. Who are these people? What do they do? What's the installed base? All of the contextual information around what your target player population may be, so that there might be an idea that you think is amazing, and it is amazing if you were deploying it in country A, but a lot of the basic mechanisms to play that game don't necessarily exist in country B, right? So this goes to, is it online game versus social network versus mobile? There are all sorts of research that needs to be done in advance. And the other, to echo Asi, is the objective and having a really clear idea of what you want to accomplish. In my own interactions at the border between games and government, oftentimes there's this kind of enthusiasm about the trend. Let's do something on Twitter. Social networking, it's hot. We've got to do something there. Or hey, let's do a game because that's fun. And it's often either technology driven or it's driven by either the desire to be current or fear of not being current. But it's not necessarily informed by the context or any particular objective. And the more work that gets done in that upfront phase, the more likely you are to be successful in your project.
If I may just underline something that Ben Sawyer said before we arrived here on the stage, which is stay on paper as long as possible. I'm being very specific now about a process that needs to be much more strategic and complicated. But deciding who your audience is, that was easy for us. My associates at the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict have been involved in trying to disseminate information about how you wage a struggle in a nonviolent way for years and years and years, and we're associated. So we know more or less what that audience is, and so we didn't have to spend a lot of time thinking about it. We did have to consider, what kind of technology is installed. We talk about installed base in the countries that we're likely to see our game used. And so among other things, that meant that on PeoplePower, we did not want to adopt the 3D visual interface. It's just much too hardware intensive and was going to be a problem. It also meant that the size of the game would be huge. But going back to what Ben said about staying on paper, there's enormous virtue in that advice. Write design documents, elaborate them through many iterations before you actually begin programming or thinking about art or creative. It will pay off in the long run because you can't make creative decisions until you have the answers to these other specifications. Who is my audience? What country are they located in? What do you want them to do? Having played the game, all of those things have to be very, very well refined before you can make creative decisions.
One last question before we go to the audience. In terms of the nuts and bolts, budgets and timelines, what would you offer in terms of lessons learned about, defining the budget around a serious game and defining a timeline around a serious game, and where you're most likely to go wrong in your projections about those numbers?
At the end of the day, going with our previous answers, I think that it's a result of many previous decisions that you're making. One big challenge with gaming, unlike, again, traditional media, is that technology is a big mess, is a big unknown. And you can design a game from, I would say, 50,000 and less, especially on mobile platforms, to 5 million and more. And that ecosystem, that complexity, is daunting. And many people look at it and look at the variety of platforms and just lose their way. And I think that by answering those things that I said before, and Steve mentioned, the idea of really understanding the audience, the context, and what you're trying to achieve, it's much easier to start narrowing it down and say, okay, actually for what I'm trying to do, mobile makes more sense than anything else because, you know, the audience has access to it, etc. Then you start to look at, in the metrics of budget and timeline, you're starting to look at something much more tangible. And those answers are there. I mean, I could now, if I hear someone come to me and say, well, I want to do a mobile game, it has to be launched next year, and it has to be that and that, it's pretty easy to say, okay, roughly this is your time and budget. But again, until you have that very narrow definition of the platform, it will be very tough to get those answers.
All right, are there any questions in the audience?
Could you explore, all of you, the space of tension between the objective of a game, the peace process, or teaching people how to do nonviolent, civil, whatever, and the space for emergent behavior that you talked about? Because it seems like there's a line there between over-scripting and under-scripting, but also how do games accommodate the kind of instructional games or social behavior change games? How do they accommodate emergent behavior that the developers do anticipate?
So the question for whoever may be viewing in video is, what's the tension between the objective of the game and the rules that you're building into it and the space for emergent behavior and, you know, the balance between under-scripting and over-scripting? Steve, you want to?
Well, the quick answer is you want to avoid, or resist is the better word. You want to resist putting up barriers to the maximum extent possible. You want, in fact, unpredictability. You want people to be given a chance to fail, to make mistakes. We're talking about serious games here, for which you could also say we're talking about educational games, games intended to teach something. But there are different kinds of teaching. I mean, to say something really pathetically obvious. I mean, there are different kinds of learning. There's the kind of learning that comes from reading a textbook and committing a lot of things to memory and taking exams, you know, learning that tends to be associated with lecture-style academic courses and so forth. And then there are many other kinds of learning, but the kind we're talking about here happens to be what's generally known as experiential learning. Providing people with an experience, letting them have an experience from which they learn something. And I think quite often there's more to be learned by making mistakes than by doing things in a kind of way that's been taught as the right way to do things. There's more than one route to go. But I think the key is experiential learning and the idea that, and so getting there, my first answer, and I'm not a game designer, getting there involves creating a system, building a model. I mean, that's the first phase of our work in both of these game projects, is building a model, creating a kind of system of systems which has no flesh on it at all. There are no characters, there are no groups, there are no graphics. You know, it's a kind of thing that can be played on a spreadsheet, in fact. You build a model in which when fear increases hostility probably does as well, or when momentum decreases, something else happens, and probably a range of things. But anyway, you build this model, and it tends to be very mathematical. I mean, it begins with ideas, begins with human psychology and the basis of human behavior and the kinds of things that people do when they're under certain kinds of pressure, or the beneficiaries of certain rewards. But that's all eventually turned into mathematical equations.
And I think it's useful to note here that the mathematical definition of a game, right, which is it has rules, it has a goal, and it has a disequilibrial outcome. And I think to Steve's point, modeling is very important and perhaps undervalued by people who are doing games for the first time. And a lot of the complexity that we're talking about has to do with the robustness and the extensibility of that underlying model. So, to the keep it on paper as long as possible, or keep it in a spreadsheet as long as possible point, sometimes the soul of a game, and particularly a simulation type game, the soul of that type of game is the model. And so you can spend a lot of time, and perhaps maybe that's the expertise that you need to bring in first, right, is someone who can turn the model that you have because of your subject matter expertise into the math that's necessary to drive that and say, okay, well, yeah, but we want to adjust that parameter a little bit. How do you do that? So modeling is very important. And then again, as you did in your game, think really, really carefully about how you make it possible for end users to adjust or extend that experience, in their own situation. So on the basic level, it's just changing around the names of things and making more of the things and text descriptions of the things. If you take it all the way out, you might want to open source your software to the point where people could actually start building an ecosystem around that model itself, or alternate models. And obviously, it depends what your business model is. But I think there's a huge opportunity in this serious games space, the space where people are not necessarily in it to become billionaires, to create a really, really exciting open source software community around these models and around the games that put the meat on those bones.
Let me just put a bottom line from my perspective. When all is said and done, there is almost no way to know what kinds of results are going to come from following a certain sequence of tactics in this game. And the only way to find out is testing. Testing. Even at the early spreadsheet stage, you can try things and see, I can't get where I want to go. There's something wrong here. We have to open up something here. Or whatever. There are just any number of possibilities that can only be discovered by testing, by playing this thing, doing unexpected things, running the same tactic 10 times in a row, and seeing, or doing nothing, just advancing turns. And let the artificial intelligence do what it's supposed to be doing, turn by turn. But the player herself is doing nothing. And you find out amazing things that you better go back and fix.
And then also, just to quantify it a little bit, it's useful to spell out for yourself how many different kinds of things that can the player make decisions about, and how many of those things interact with each other. Right? And the higher those numbers are, the more unpredictable your game is going to be.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question, and I'm not a game designer, but I've interviewed a ton of game designers. And I think that both what Steve and JC were saying is very relevant, and sort of what I feel like, and I hope this isn't a lame answer, but that what the game designers that I've talked to about this will say is that the emergent behavior, it's almost like the magic of a game, that if you create a robust system, and balance is something game designers talk about a lot. So if you have, and again, the Will Wright idea of that a very small set of rules can create incredibly complex behavior, that when you create a rule set and you have a win state and then you kind of set people free to play, it's almost impossible to avoid unexpected outcomes. Will Wright is someone I spent a lot of time interviewing, and he had the most amazing stories about what happened in The Sims, just things that he just never could have imagined, and how that was the funnest part of being a game designer. For example, he was telling me a story about talking to kids who, when they first played The Sims, the first thing they tried to do was kill their Sims. And everybody was like, oh, this is so horrible, this is so horrible. And Will said that that's exactly what should be happening, right? Because they're playing, they're pushing against the boundaries of the rules. When people are in a game, I always think game players are sort of little embodiments of, the scientific method, right? They're testing. What happens if I do X? Yeah. What happens if I do Y? And that mindset that players get into is one of the most interesting things to me about games, if that's helpful at all.
I think this side of the room has been ignored. So let's have a question here.
So I wanted to continue on the modeling thread by raising something that Ben Sawyer said earlier, which is, with a game, the point is not necessarily complete fidelity, but especially when it comes to serious games in the environment and diplomacy space, one of the things that I worry about is building trust and the relationship between that and transparency. So we can look in the environmental space and see climate modelers all over the world. They update their climate models, they produce a journal article, they test model against measurements, and then they have 100 references in their article, and they're still guaranteed to get beat up in the media, at least these days. Now, when I'm playing a serious game, the first thing I'm going to ask about emergent behavior is, when something emerges that nobody expected, can I trust what it is? And so I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on the relationship between games and models and transparency, and for what some people in the simulation community would call verification and validation. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, maybe I'll start on that, and that's I think it's really related to the last question. So one myth to break is that no game is really a complete sandbox. So, even when people talk about Will Wright and his genius design and how much The Sims and SimCity are those environments that you can do whatever you like, at the end of the day, there are many, many small and large design decisions that Will Wright took on making sure how that system behaves. And I think that at the heart of every game, if it's a peace simulation or a PeoplePower game or an environment model, there are those decisions that at the end of the day will affect even the emergent behavior. And those rules, you talked about those rules of the system, they can be defined, they can be tweaked based on testing, and you can make sure that at the end of the day, in terms of transparency, accuracy, you're on topic. The other thing that I wanted to mention is that the audience is also very important here, and to talk about also related to the testing idea. So as much as we say stay on paper, I would also say test on paper. So in a sense, even before you code one line, there are many things that you can test with your audience. And for us, in terms of that decision on how much sandbox Peacemaker, for example, should be, came from the audience, because we wanted to leave it much more open than our Palestinian audience wanted it to be. And they came back to us when we made it without any winning conditions and with things like invade Canada or nuke the other side. And they came back to us and say, no, guys, we want a two-state solution at the end. We want an independent state at the end of the Palestinian game we play. So this is another thing to say about the testing and the idea that a lot of the things you can, in a very early stage, rather than develop the full product and give it to your audience, hear from them already in the design stage.
Yeah, I think that's a really great question, and something that I often like to say when talking about games. and there's a woman named Mary Flanagan, who's a game designer, who talks about this a lot, which is that there are always values built into a system. So we like to think like it's a system, it's a simulation, it is objective, it has no bias, but there's always the person who created, and since Will Wright keeps coming up, you know, in Sim City, if you raise taxes, you get urban unrest. So that's an assumption, right? That's a bias. So if you find yourself getting into this space and exploring simulations and games, I think it's really an important thing to keep in mind, which is what biases am I putting in here? And then just the other quick point I want to make, since the issue of climate change simulations came up, is there are so many people creating simulations, the government, you know, wargaming, climate simulations, that I think there's a big opportunity in the serious game world to take these simulations and build a game layer over it. So for example, when a climate change organization builds a simulation of what they think will happen in 10 years, is the right thing to do with that information to write an article in a journal, or is the right solution to turn that simulation into a game and let people play with it and have the experience of what will happen themselves? Maybe that's an even better learning opportunity.
Or even a discourse about the simulation itself, because as you said, all simulations have biases. In SimCity, it's impossible to build a thriving city without investing a lot of money in public transportation. Mm-hmm.
If it's
that's mm-hmm. something that Will Wright believes, you know, and obviously we've seen a lot of back and forth about models in you know, climate change, and you know, every time there's a presidential election, both political parties come up with a budget simulation that you can play, and you can only win those simulations if you do certain things that are consistent with either party's beliefs about how you balance a budget and build a thriving economy. And so, to your point about trust, I think if there's an area where the model is in any way contentious, that you have to be very transparent about what the model actually is, so that if people want to argue with the result, they can say, well, you did this because your model does that, but I think something else. And if you change this about your model, well, the outcome would change here. And that process is, even for the people who disagree with you, that the transparency associated with that builds trust, because you're willing to make your assumptions explicit rather than having this black box that, you know, comes out with a result when you play a certain way and not other ways.
If it's not already clear, at the risk of saying something terribly simple, but simulations and games are not synonymous. A simulation is one thing and a game is another thing. A simulation is often used by scientists, be they social scientists or physicists or whatever, to study something, a system, let's say. Games, at least the way we approach games, I won't make any claims for others, are meant to teach something, not to study it.
Well, a game also has a goal. You know,
precisely,
so,
yeah. But simulations approach reality, in fact, whereas games choose to model only a very limited number of variables, hopefully sufficient to the purpose at hand, but not more. And a simulation often will have far, far more variables, and it can be quite boring to play because it's not a game. It's not fun. It wasn't designed to be fun. It was meant to achieve some scientific or academic purpose. Anyway, we've certainly resisted. I mean, you hear people refer to, in fact, I've heard people refer to our game as a simulation game, which is almost an oxymoron in my book. And I try to resist it and explain. I'm not prickly about it, but there is a difference, huge difference.
So we're out of time before coffee, but everyone is here, and people with questions.